The ranch sat alone on the empty plains, far from any town, far from any people. The old rancher had lived there for many years in silence and solitude. His days were long and quiet, stretching from sunrise to sunset with only the sound of wind and the calls of animals to break the stillness. He worked the land every day, fixing broken fences, caring for his horses, and talking only to himself and the creatures around him. People in town knew of him, but they kept their distance. They saw him as a hard man, cold and distant, someone who wanted to be left alone. What they did not know was that deep inside his heart, he carried old scars and pain from a life lived in loss. He had once had a family, but they were gone now, taken by time and sorrow, so he chose the company of the land instead of people. One cold night, when storm clouds gathered above the plains and wind howled like a wild animal, the rancher was inside his small cabin. Sitting by the fire, thunder rolled across the sky, and rain began to fall hard against the wooden walls. The rancher sat quiet, listening to the sounds of the storm, as he had listened to many storms before. But then, something was different. Something caught his ear over the noise of the wind and rain. It was a sound like crying, like voices far away in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his mind. But the sound came again, more clear this time. It was the voice of someone in pain or fear. The rancher stood up slowly. His old joints creaked as he reached for his coat. He grabbed a lantern from the wall and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Wind and rain hit his face immediately, cold and sharp. He held the lantern high and looked out into the darkness. The light showed the barn, the fences, and beyond that, only the empty black of the night. The crying sound came again. This time it seemed to come from near the barn. The rancher moved forward into the storm. His boots sinking into the wet mud, his lantern swayed in his hand as he walked. When he reached the barn, he stopped and listened. The sound was louder now. It was not the cry of an animal caught in the brush. It was the voice of a human, a voice in desperate need of help. Following the sound, the rancher walked to the far side of the barn. There, on the wet ground near the fence, he saw something that made him stop completely. It was a large cloth sack, old and dirty, lying in the mud, and from inside it came the sound of desperate cries. "Please, please open it," a weak voice begged from inside the sack. "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," the voice gasped. The rancher's hands began to shake. For so many years, no one had come to his land. No one had needed his help. No one had spoken to him except for the rare visit to town for supplies. Now, standing in the rain with his lantern in hand, he saw something that would change everything. He moved forward quickly, his old hands reaching for the knots that held the sack closed. His fingers were cold and stiff, but he worked to pull the knots loose. When at last the sack opened, the rancher froze completely. His mind stopped working for a moment. Inside the sack was not one person, but two. A woman lay there, pale and bruised, her dress torn and dirty. Her face was white with fear and pain. She gasped for air like a fish pulled from water. And beside her, clinging to her dress and shaking with terror, was a child, a young girl with wide eyes filled with fear. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice almost gone. "Please help us." The rancher did not move for a long moment. He could not move. His mind was full of confusion. How had they come to be here, in this sack, in the mud and rain? Who would do such a cruel thing? What had brought them to his ranch, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a terrible storm? But the woman gasped again, and the child clung tighter to her, and the rancher felt something wake up inside him, something he thought was dead and gone. Without thinking, without hesitation, he reached down and lifted the woman carefully into his arms. She was light, too light, as if she had not eaten in days. The child grabbed his sleeve with both hands. "Holding on for safety, it's all right," he said softly. The first kind words he had spoken to another human in longer than he could remember. "It's cold, but you can hold me if you want. I will keep you safe." The morning light crept slowly through the cracks in the cabin walls, casting thin golden lines across the wooden floor. The rancher had not slept. He sat in the old chair by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dying embers, waiting for the first signs that the woman and child were truly safe. By dawn, the woman's breathing had steadied. Her color had returned to her pale cheeks, and she stirred slightly on the blanket he had laid out for her. The girl still clung to her mother, even in sleep, their fingers intertwined as if afraid the other might disappear. When the woman's eyes finally opened, they were filled with confusion. She looked around the small cabin, at the rough wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the man sitting across from her like a guardian angel made of dust and old sorrows. For a moment she did not speak. She only stared, trying to understand where she was and how she had come to be alive. The rancher noticed her fear and spoke in a voice softer than the wind outside. "You're safe now," he said. "You're on my ranch, far from those men." The woman tried to sit up, but her body was too weak. She fell back against the pillow with a soft groan. Pain shot through her ribs, her arms, everywhere they had beaten her. She closed her eyes and tears slipped down her temples, silently rolling into her hair. The rancher rose from his chair and poured water into a tin cup. He brought it to her lips and she drank slowly, gratefully. The simple act of drinking cool water felt like a miracle to her, a sign that she was truly alive and not caught in some terrible dream. "How long was I in the sack?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The rancher thought for a moment. "Not long, a few hours at most. The storm helped. The wind carried your voice far enough for me to hear." The woman closed her eyes again. Thanking whatever God might be listening, she had thought that sack was her tomb, that she and her daughter would die in the darkness, suffocating together. But fate had other plans. Kindness had found them in the form of a stranger, a lonely man who had chosen to help instead of turn away. As the day progressed, the woman began to share her story. Piece by painful piece, she told the rancher about the men who came to her farm, about how they wanted to take her daughter, to use her for terrible purposes. When she refused, they grew angry. They burned her home, they beat her, and they swore they would never stop hunting her. She ran with her daughter into the night, running through forests and across plains, sleeping in barns and under open sky, always looking over her shoulder. The child woke as her mother spoke. Her small face was pale, her eyes too old for a girl so young. She had seen things no child should ever see. She had heard her mother cry, had felt her fear. The girl clung to her mother and listened as she told this man their story. At first, the child was afraid of him, but slowly, as the rancher moved quietly about the cabin, speaking gently and working to make them comfortable, something changed in her little heart. She began to see him not as a stranger, but as protection. The rancher prepared simple food for them, broth made from dried vegetables and meat, nothing fancy, but warm and nourishing. He fed the child first, making sure she had enough to regain her strength. The girl ate slowly, her small mouth working carefully. When she finished, she looked up at him and asked a question that struck him like a stone. "Are you our papa now?" The rancher froze, his hand hung in the air. He had not known how to respond to such a simple question that carried so much weight. He looked at the woman, whose eyes were filled with tears. He looked at the child, whose small face held such hope, such desperate need in that moment. Something deep inside him shifted. A wall he had built long ago, a wall made of grief and isolation, began to crack. "If you want me to be," he said finally. His voice thick with emotion. The child smiled. The first real smile he had seen on her face. It transformed her entire being, changing her from a frightened victim into a girl full of possibility. The woman sobbed quietly, covering her mouth with her hand. Relief washed over her like a wave. For the first time since her nightmare began, she felt that her daughter might actually be okay, that they both might actually have a chance at something resembling a normal life. Over the following days, the woman regained more of her strength. She moved from the blanket by the fire to a simple bed in the corner of the cabin. She began to help with small tasks, washing dishes, folding clothes, doing whatever she could to repay the kindness this man had shown. The rancher refused her gratitude, simply saying that no thanks were needed. He had done what was right, and that was enough. The girl, meanwhile, became his shadow. She followed him everywhere, watching as he worked, listening as he spoke, Learning his rhythms and his quiet ways, she asked him countless questions about the ranch, about why he lived alone, about what had happened to make him so sad. He answered most of her questions. Though some he kept to himself, his past was still too raw, too painful to share, but slowly answering her innocent questions helped him begin to heal. At night, the three of them would sit by the fire, the woman and the child on one side, the rancher on the other. The girl would lean against her mother and watch him with curious eyes. The woman would sometimes hum an old song, soft and gentle. The rancher would simply sit and listen, and for the first time in many years, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt like peace. 2 weeks had passed since the woman and child arrived at the ranch, and the girl had begun to smile more often. She helped the rancher feed the chickens each morning, scattering seeds from a tin cup he had given her. Her laughter rang out across the quiet land like bells, a sound that had been absent for so long that both the woman and the rancher stopped their work sometimes just to listen to it. But beneath the surface of this fragile peace, danger still lurked. The woman knew this. She had seen the faces of the men who hunted her, and she understood that they would not simply give up. They would keep searching. They would keep hunting. And sooner or later, they might find this remote ranch. One evening, as the rancher was checking the fences near the property line, he noticed fresh hoof prints in the soft earth. They were not his, and they were not old. Someone had been riding along the edge of his land, watching, waiting. When he returned to the cabin, his face was grave. The woman saw it immediately, and her body went rigid with fear. The rancher told her what he had found, and the woman's hands began to shake. She stood and walked to the small window, peering out into the darkness beyond. "They're here," she whispered. "They've found us." The rancher placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her, but inside he was calculating. He was thinking about what he would need to do to protect them. He was a man who had spent decades avoiding conflict, avoiding people, avoiding anything that might complicate his simple life. But now, faced with the need to defend this woman and child he had come to care for deeply, something ancient and powerful awakened within him. The instinct to protect, the will to fight, the determination to do whatever was necessary. The woman sat down heavily on the bench by the table, and she began to tell him more about the men, about who they really were. She explained that they were part of a gang that operated across several states, a gang that preyed on vulnerable families, that took children and women and sold them to the highest bidder. Her husband had been a lawman, a good man who had tried to stop them. He had gathered evidence against them, planning to bring them to justice. But they had discovered his plans, and they had made sure he never got the chance. They burned his office, they burned his home, and they swore they would take everything from him, including his wife and daughter, when her husband died trying to protect her during their escape. The woman thought all was lost. She ran with nothing but the clothes on her back and her young daughter in her arms. She hid in forests and mountains. She moved from town to town, always staying ahead of the men who pursued her. But they were relentless, professional, and patient. They had resources, connections, and no conscience. Eventually, they tracked her to a small settlement near the edge of the rancher's land. They cornered her in an alley, and when she tried to run, they caught her. They put her in that sack, planning to move her under the cover of the storm, to transport her somewhere she could never escape. "My husband wanted me to deliver his evidence to the federal marshal in the capital city," she said, her voice steady now with purpose. "He had documents, letters, names of all the men involved, records of their crimes. If that information reaches the right people, they could be stopped. They could be arrested and imprisoned. My daughter could finally be safe." The rancher listened carefully, understanding the weight of what she was saying. "Where is this evidence?" he asked. "Hidden," she replied. "My husband buried it near our old home, about 3 days' ride from here. He gave me a map drawn on old leather. I've kept it hidden all this time, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone I could trust, someone strong enough to help me." The rancher was quiet for a long moment. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkness, thinking about the life he had lived, the years he had spent hiding from the world, running from his own pain. What did his solitude mean in the face of this woman's suffering? What good was his peace if it came at the cost of others' safety? He turned back to face her, and his decision was made. "We will go," he said simply. "We will get that evidence, and we will deliver it to the federal marshal. Those men will not take anything else from you or your daughter, not while I still draw breath." The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief. For so long, she had carried this burden alone. For so long, she had been powerless. But now, standing before this man who had shown her such kindness, she felt something shift inside her. She felt hope, real hope, for the first time since her husband's death. That night, the rancher began to prepare. He cleaned his old rifle, a gun he had not fired in many years. He packed supplies for a long journey. He prepared the horses, checking their hooves and their strength. The woman and child watched him work, understanding that everything was about to change, that this moment marked the end of their hiding and the beginning of their fight back. Before dawn broke over the plains, the rancher had the horses saddled and ready. The woman had dressed in borrowed clothes, sturdy pants, and a thick shirt that belonged to the rancher's late sister, clothes he had kept all these years without knowing why. Now it seemed fate had put them there for this exact purpose. The girl wore similar practical clothing, and though she was small, she sat tall in the saddle, her little hands gripping the reins with determination. The rancher had given her a gentle mare, a horse he had raised from a foal, an animal that seemed to understand the child's fear and moved with extra care. The woman held the leather map her late husband had drawn, its edges worn from being hidden and carried. The rancher studied it by candlelight before they departed, tracing the route with his weathered finger. 3 days of hard riding through unfamiliar territory, 3 days where they would be exposed, vulnerable, visible to anyone who might be watching. But there was no other way. The evidence was the only thing that could truly protect them, the only weapon that could destroy the men hunting them. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the 3 of them rode out from the ranch. The rancher led the way, his rifle secured to his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The woman rode behind him, keeping the child close, watching their back trail for any sign of pursuit. They moved at a steady pace, fast enough to cover distance but slow enough that the girl would not fall behind or grow too exhausted. The rancher had done this kind of riding before, long ago in his youth, when he was a different man with a different life. Around midday, they stopped near a small creek to water the horses and rest. The rancher gave the woman and child dried meat and hard bread, simple food but filling. The girl drank from the creek, cupping the cold water in her small hands, looking up at the sky as if seeing it for the first time. She had been trapped for so long, first in fear on her farm, then in the sack, then in hiding. Now, riding across open land under an endless sky, she seemed to be discovering what freedom actually felt like. As they rested, the woman spoke to the rancher about her husband. She told him stories of their life together, how they had met in a small town, how he had decided to become a lawman because he believed in justice, how he had loved their daughter with a fierceness that matched his commitment to protecting others. She told him about the day everything changed, when her husband came home, with news that he had finally gathered enough evidence to bring down the entire operation. He had been so excited, so certain that finally, after years of dangerous work, it would all be worth it. But the men had been watching him. The woman explained how they had discovered his plans, how they had moved quickly and ruthlessly. They had set fires throughout the town to create chaos and confusion. In that chaos, they had attacked her home. Her husband had fought them, had bought her enough time to escape with their daughter. But in the end, there had been too many of them. She had escaped through a back window, carrying their daughter. Running into the night, she had heard the sounds of violence behind her, sounds she tried to block out but could never quite forget. The rancher listened without interrupting, understanding now the full weight of her journey, the full scope of her loss. When she finished, he simply nodded, then stood and checked the horses, making sure they were ready for the next stretch of travel. They rode until the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep purples and reds. The rancher found a small grove of trees near another water source, a place that offered some shelter and concealment. They made a simple camp, the rancher building a small fire while the woman prepared a meal of beans and dried vegetables over the flames. The girl sat between them, her exhaustion evident in the way her eyes kept closing, but she fought sleep, not wanting to miss anything, wanting to be part of this adventure that meant her survival. As darkness fell completely, the rancher kept watch, his rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the perimeter of their camp. The woman sat with her daughter, singing softly, an old lullaby her own mother had taught her. The child finally succumbed to sleep, leaning against her mother's chest. The rancher listened to the woman's song, feeling something stir in his chest, a feeling he had thought was dead, a feeling almost like hope. Around midnight, the rancher heard something, a distant sound, the noise of horses moving quickly across the land. The gang was searching, moving through the territory, hunting. The rancher's jaw tightened. He did not wake the woman and child, but he moved closer to them, positioning himself between them and the direction of the sound. He sat with his rifle ready, listening, waiting, prepared to fight if the hunters found them. The sound eventually faded, the riders moving in a different direction. But sleep did not come to the rancher for the rest of the night. He remained vigilant, watching over his charges like a guardian angel made of muscle and determination. When dawn finally came, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold, he woke the woman gently. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly. "They're close, but not close enough if we ride hard today. We might reach your husband's burial site by evening." The second day of travel brought them through terrain that grew increasingly difficult. The rolling plains gave way to rocky hills, and the hills began to rise into mountains. The path became narrower, more treacherous. The horses had to pick their way carefully over loose stones and steep inclines. The woman studied the leather map constantly, comparing the landmarks drawn by her dead husband with the landscape around them. The rancher watched her work, seeing the determination in her face, the way she refused to let doubt creep in. Even as doubt began to creep into his own mind, by late afternoon, they reached a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountainside. The map indicated this was the way. The rancher did not like it. Canyons were places where travelers could be trapped, places where pursuers could corner you with no escape route. But there was no alternative. The map showed this path led directly to the burial site, and they were running out of time. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown closer throughout the day. The rancher had caught glimpses of dust on the horizon, signs that the gang was narrowing their search, getting closer to finding them. As they entered the canyon, the temperature dropped. The walls of rock rose on either side of them, blocking out the late afternoon sun. Their voices echoed off the stone, amplified by the enclosed space. The girl moved closer to her mother, sensing the danger inherent in this narrow passage. The rancher kept his hand on his rifle, his eyes alert for any sign of an ambush. They moved slowly, carefully, the horses picking their way along the rough ground. Halfway through the canyon, they heard a sound that made them all freeze. A voice, calling from somewhere ahead. "Come out, woman," the voice shouted. "We know you're in there. There's nowhere left to run." The rancher pulled his horse to a stop and raised his hand, signaling the woman and child to do the same. His mind raced, calculating possibilities. The gang had somehow gotten ahead of them, had anticipated their route and positioned themselves for an ambush. The rancher looked back down the canyon, then ahead at the narrowing passage. They were trapped exactly as he had feared. "Stay here," he whispered to the woman. "Keep the child close, and if anything happens, ride back the way we came. Get to the open plains where you can see them coming." "No," the woman said firmly. "We didn't come this far to turn back now. My husband died so this could happen. Our daughter will not live in fear forever because I was too afraid to fight." The rancher looked at her, seeing the steel in her eyes, the same strength that had carried her this far. He nodded slowly. then turned his horse and began walking forward into the canyon. His rifle was raised but not pointed. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving himself time to see what lay ahead, giving the woman and child time to prepare if they needed to run. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, he saw them. 5 men on horseback. Blocking the path completely, they were hard men, weathered by violence and greed. Their clothes were stained with dust and worse. Their faces were cruel, calculating. The man in the center was larger than the others, with a scarred face and eyes like chips of ice. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice thick with an accent the rancher could not quite place. "The old man comes riding into our trap like he doesn't even see it. Where's the woman and the girl, old-timer?" The rancher did not answer immediately. He was studying the men, their positions, the layout of the canyon, calculating distances and trajectories. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "They're not here. I sent them on a different route." "You're hunting ghosts," the scarred man laughed, a harsh, brutal sound. "You're lying. We've been tracking them all day. They're with you. We can smell their fear." He gestured to one of the other men. "Go back down the canyon and bring them out." But before the man could move, the woman's voice rang out from behind the rancher. "I'm here," she called. "Let the child go. And you can have me." The rancher's heart sank. She had disobeyed his instruction to run. She had chosen to face them instead. The scarred man's smile grew wider, more predatory. "Brave," he said. "Stupid, but brave. Your husband was brave too. Right before we burned him alive." The words hit the rancher like a physical blow. These were the men who had killed her husband. These were the men responsible for all her suffering, all her loss. The rancher felt something ignite inside him, a rage so profound and ancient that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own soul. "You'll not take them," the rancher said, his voice now carrying a quality that made even the scarred man pause. "You'll not have them, and you'll not leave this canyon alive." The scarred man's expression shifted from amusement to anger. "Kill him," he commanded. The canyon erupted into violence. The rancher drew his rifle and fired in one smooth motion, the shot echoing off the stone walls like thunder. The man who had been about to advance fell from his horse. The rancher fired again, and another man went down. But there were still 3 men left, and they were moving, spreading out, trying to flank him from behind. The woman had grabbed a rifle from their supplies. She fired once, the shot going wild but enough to distract the men. The child screamed, a sound of pure terror and rage. The rancher moved his horse sideways, using it as a shield, continuing to fire with practiced efficiency. His years of solitude had not made him forget how to fight, how to survive. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The scarred man was the last one standing, facing the rancher across the canyon floor. His gun was drawn, his finger on the trigger. "For the woman," the rancher said quietly, and then he fired. The shot echoed through the canyon like the voice of God himself. The scarred man staggered backward, his gun falling from his hand. He looked down at his chest in disbelief, seeing the blood spreading across his shirt like a dark flower blooming. He fell to his knees, then collapsed onto the rocky ground. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one weaker than the last. The rancher did not move, did not speak. He simply sat on his horse, watching, making sure the threat was truly ended. The woman rushed forward, the rifle still in her hands. But she stopped when she saw the scarred man on the ground. She stood over him, her body trembling with emotion. This man had haunted her nightmares. This man had been responsible for burning her home, for taking her husband, for threatening her daughter's life. Now, finally, he was dying, fading away into nothing. "Why?" she asked him, her voice breaking. "Why did you do it? Why did you have to destroy everything?" The scarred man's eyes turned toward her, and for a moment, something almost like recognition flickered across his face. "Money," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "Always money, always power, your husband. Your husband tried to stop us, tried to take it all away." His words trailed off into silence as his breath stopped. His eyes stared upward at nothing, seeing nothing. The woman turned away, unable to look at his body any longer. The rancher climbed down from his horse and approached her. Placing a hand on her shoulder, "It's over," he said quietly. "He can't hurt you anymore." But the woman shook her head slowly. "It's not over," she said. "There are more of them, more men, more violence. This is just one piece of a much larger evil. We still have to reach the burial site. We still have to retrieve my husband's evidence." The girl emerged from where she had been hiding behind the rocks, her small face streaked with tears. She ran to her mother and wrapped her arms around her waist. The rancher looked at the bodies scattered across the canyon floor, 5 men who would no longer prey on innocent people. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a weariness. A reminder of why he had left violence behind so many years ago. They took what supplies the dead men had carried, and the rancher checked their saddlebags carefully. Inside one of them he found something unexpected: maps, detailed maps of the region, marked with the locations of other gang members, notes about safe houses and hideouts. This information was almost as valuable as the evidence the woman's husband had gathered. Together, they could create a comprehensive picture of the entire criminal operation. The rancher led them back the way they came, exiting the canyon as quickly as the horses could safely move. He did not want to spend another moment in that place of death. As they emerged onto open ground, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. They made camp that night in a sheltered spot with a clear view of the surrounding terrain. No more surprises, the rancher had decided. No more traps. The woman sat by the fire holding her daughter close. The child had witnessed violence today, had seen men killed, had been terrified. But she had also seen her mother fight, had seen her refuse to be a victim any longer. The psychological impact of these events would ripple through the child's life. The rancher knew, but perhaps, if they survived what was coming, the child would also learn resilience, strength, the capacity to overcome darkness. "Tell me about your husband," the rancher said as they sat in the firelight. "Tell me who he really was." The woman smiled sadly. "He was a good man," she began. "Better than most, he grew up in a small town, raised by a single mother who worked as a seamstress. He learned early on that justice was something you had to fight for, something that didn't come naturally in this world. When he was old enough, he became a lawman, determined to protect people like his mother. People who had no one else." She paused, staring into the flames. "We met when I was working as a teacher in a schoolhouse near his town. He was investigating a series of thefts, and I helped him gather information from the children who had witnessed the crimes. He was so dedicated, so passionate about his work. I fell in love with him almost immediately. We married within a year." "And the gang?" the rancher asked. "He discovered them by accident," the woman continued. "A man came to him asking for help, claiming he had been forced to work for them. That he wanted to escape, my husband began investigating, and what he found horrified him. The gang was trafficking in human beings, children mostly, selling them to the highest bidder for unspeakable purposes. He became obsessed with stopping them, documenting everything, gathering evidence." She looked at the leather map that lay on the ground beside her. "He hid his findings along with copies of government documents and correspondence. He buried them near our home because he knew the gang would eventually discover what he was doing. He wanted to make sure that even if something happened to him, the evidence would survive, that justice would eventually be served." The rancher understood now the full scope of this woman's burden. She was not just running for her life. She was fulfilling her husband's mission, carrying forward his legacy, ensuring that his death meant something. "Then we will complete what he started," the rancher said firmly. "We will reach that burial site, we will retrieve that evidence, and we will deliver it to the federal marshal. Your husband's sacrifice will not be in vain." The woman looked at him with gratitude so profound it seemed to shine from her eyes. She reached out and took his hand, holding it gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being the man you are." That night, as the fire burned down to embers, the rancher sat awake, thinking about redemption, about how a man could spend years running from his past, only to find that his past had been preparing him for this exact moment. This woman and child needed him, and he would not fail them. The morning sun rose pale and cold over the mountains. casting long shadows that stretched across the rocky terrain like dark fingers reaching out from the earth itself. The rancher, the woman, and the child had been riding since before dawn, following the increasingly detailed landmarks on the leather map. A twisted juniper tree bent by decades of wind. A rock formation shaped like an eagle with wings spread wide. A dry stream bed that cut through a valley like an old scar. Each landmark brought them closer to their destination, and each one brought them closer to the truth that lay buried somewhere in this desolate landscape. The woman held the map with shaking hands, not from fear this time, but from anticipation, from nervous energy, from the knowledge that soon, very soon, her husband's legacy would be revealed. The child rode silently beside her, having grown quieter with each passing day, as if she too sensed that something significant was approaching. The rancher watched both of them carefully, understanding that this moment would define everything that came after. If they found the evidence, they had hope. If they did not, if the gang or time or nature had destroyed what her husband had hidden, then everything they had endured would be for nothing. By midday, they reached a narrow valley that matched the map precisely. The woman pointed ahead to a stand of pine trees, ancient and gnarled, growing at the base of a steep cliff. There, she said, her voice barely audible. He marked it with 3 trees in a triangle formation. He said if anything happened to him, I would recognize it immediately. The rancher led them to the trees and dismounted. Studying the ground around the base of the trunks, he had done this kind of searching before, long ago in his youth, looking for signs in the earth, looking for evidence of human presence. After several minutes he found what he was looking for. The soil in one spot appeared to have been disturbed, then carefully replaced, covered over with pine needles and rocks. It had been done skillfully, but not skillfully enough to fool an experienced eye. "Here," he called to the woman. She dismounted as if moving in a dream. As if this moment was not quite real, the child stayed with the horses, understanding instinctively that this was something between the woman and her dead husband, something private and sacred. The rancher and the woman began to dig, their hands working at the soil. Moving rocks and earth aside, the work was hard, painful, and after what seemed like hours, their fingers finally struck something solid. Wood, a wooden box, sealed and preserved, buried deep enough to survive the elements, deep enough to survive years. The rancher carefully lifted the box from the ground. It was smaller than the woman had expected, but heavy with the weight of secrets and truth. She knelt beside it, trembling, unable to open it herself. The rancher worked gently at the seals, breaking the wax that her husband had used to protect the contents. When the lid finally opened, they saw papers, dozens of them, documents written in careful script, names listed meticulously, dates, locations, descriptions of crimes so horrific that even the woman, who had lived through this nightmare, felt her stomach turn. There were photographs, too, taken in secret, showing children in cages, showing men counting money, showing the face of the scarred man they had killed in the canyon, along with faces of men they had not yet encountered. Some of those faces were marked with symbols indicating they were already deceased or imprisoned, but others were marked with question marks indicating they were still at large, still operating, still preying on innocent people. Among the papers was a letter, addressed simply to "My Love." The woman picked it up with reverent hands, recognizing her husband's handwriting, and began to read silently. Tears streamed down her face as she read his words. Words written by a man who had known he was in danger, who had known he might not survive, but who had believed so deeply in what he was doing that he had accepted that risk. The letter explained everything: the gang's operations, their connections to corrupt officials, their network that stretched across multiple states and territories. It explained how her husband had discovered that some of these officials were protecting the gang in exchange for a share of their profits. He had written about his fear that if he went through normal channels, the evidence might be suppressed or destroyed. So he had hidden it here, trusting that someday, somehow, it would reach the right people. At the bottom of the letter, he had written, "If you are reading this, my beloved, then I am gone. But do not despair. Do not give up. Take this evidence to the federal marshal. Tell him everything. Trust that justice will prevail. Protect our daughter. Teach her that evil may triumph in the short term, but truth and righteousness always win in the end. I love you both beyond measure. I will wait for you in whatever comes after this life." The woman sobbed. Unable to control her grief any longer, the rancher placed his hand on her back, offering what comfort he could. The child, sensing something was wrong, came running from where she had been with the horses. She wrapped her small arms around her mother, and the three of them stood together in that ancient valley, united in their determination to finish what one man had started. The rancher carefully placed all the documents back in the box, sealing it as best he could. "We ride for the capital city," he said. "We ride until we reach the federal marshal's office, and we do not stop. We do not rest. Until this evidence is in the right hands." The woman nodded. Wiping her tears, she looked down at her daughter. "Your father would be proud of us," she whispered. "Your father would be so proud." The capital city loomed before them like a monument to civilization itself. After days of riding through wilderness and mountains, the sight of buildings and streets and people felt almost alien. The rancher had not been to a city in more than a decade, had deliberately chosen isolation over the complexities of urban life. But now, as he rode alongside the woman and child, he felt something different. He felt purpose. He felt like a man who had finally found his reason for existing. They rode directly to the federal marshal's office, a brick building with tall windows and an imposing entrance. The rancher helped the woman dismount, then lifted the child down from her horse. The wooden box containing her husband's evidence was secured in the rancher's saddlebag, wrapped in cloth to protect it. The woman took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was about to come. She had practiced what she would say 100 times during their journey, but now that the moment was here, the words seemed to scatter like frightened birds. Inside the office, they were greeted by a marshal named Harrison, a man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw. He listened as the woman told her story, listened without interruption as she explained about her husband's investigation, about the gang, about the evidence buried in the mountains. When she finished, Marshal Harrison's expression had hardened into something grim and determined. "I need to see these documents," he said simply. The rancher produced the box and opened it carefully, spreading the contents across the marshal's desk, papers, photographs, letters, all of it arranged like pieces of a puzzle that would finally reveal the complete picture of corruption and evil. Marshal Harrison studied each item meticulously, his jaw tightening as he read. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold and focused. "This is comprehensive," he said. "More comprehensive than anything we've been able to gather on our own. Your husband did important work, ma'am. Dangerous work, but important. I'm going to personally ensure that every name on this list is investigated. Every location is visited. Every official mentioned is questioned." Over the following weeks, the capital city erupted in activity. Federal agents descended on locations marked in the documents. Arrests were made. Investigations were opened. Some of the names on the list turned out to be men already in positions of power, men who had seemed respectable and trustworthy on the surface. Their exposure shocked the city and sent ripples through the government itself. The scandal grew. Newspapers ran headlines about the operation, about the trafficking network, about the corruption that had allowed it to flourish. The woman and child remained in the capital, staying in a modest boarding house that the federal marshal had arranged for them. The rancher stayed nearby, unable to bring himself to leave them. Even though his nature pulled him back towards solitude, the child had begun to smile again, had begun to attend school, had begun the long process of healing from the trauma she had endured. The woman had found work with a dressmaker, using skills she had learned from her late mother, slowly rebuilding a life that had been stolen from her. One evening, as the sun set over the capital city, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the marshal invited the rancher and the woman to his office. He had news, he said, important news, when they arrived. He showed them a report documenting the arrests, the trials, the convictions that had resulted from the evidence they had provided. 17 men had been arrested. 12 had been convicted and sent to prison. 3 had died resisting arrest, and 2 had fled the country. The marshal was still pursuing the last two, but the heart of the operation had been destroyed. "Your husband's sacrifice was not in vain," Marshal Harrison told the woman. "Because of what he did, because of your bravery in protecting that evidence and bringing it to us, we have saved countless lives. There are children in safe houses right now who would be dead or enslaved if not for you three." The woman wept, but this time her tears were different. They were tears of healing, tears of closure, tears that acknowledged her loss while also honoring what had been gained. She looked at the rancher, and in that look was a question, an unspoken question about what would come next, about what the three of them would do now that their mission was complete. The rancher understood the question without it being asked. He had spent years running from connection, from responsibility, from the very thing that made life worth living. But this woman and child had changed him. They had reminded him that isolation was not protection. It was simply another form of death. He thought about his empty ranch, his solitary existence, his decades of running from his own pain. "Come back with me," he said simply. "Not to hide, not to run, but to build something real, something that matters. The ranch is your home if you want it to be. The girl can grow up in open air and sunlight. You can build a life there. We can build a life together." The woman smiled through her tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I would like that very much." The child, understanding that something important had been decided, wrapped her arms around the rancher's neck and hugged him fiercely, and in that embrace, he felt something he had thought was lost forever. He felt like a father, like a protector, like a man who had finally found his way home. 3 months later, the rancher, the woman, and the child rode back toward the ranch. The evidence had been delivered. Justice had been served. The gang had been broken. The woman's husband's sacrifice had meant something. The girl laughed as she rode her gentle mare, her voice carrying across the plains like music. Behind them, the capital city faded into the distance. Ahead of them lay open sky and endless possibility. The rancher looked at the woman beside him, at the child ahead of them, and he smiled. It was a smile that came from deep within, a smile that acknowledged pain and loss but also embraced hope and healing. He had come to this woman and child as a stranger, a lonely old man who had thought his life was over. But instead, he had been given a second chance. He had been given redemption, and as they rode toward the sunset, toward the ranch that would become their home, the rancher understood that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from isolation, but from connection, not from running away, but from standing and fighting for those you love. He had learned this lesson through tragedy and danger, but he had learned it, and now, finally, he could live his remaining years knowing that his life had meant something, that his existence had mattered. The three of them disappeared into the landscape, becoming part of the legend of the Old West, a story that would be told and retold, a story of love and courage and redemption, a story that proved that even in the darkest times, hope could survive, justice could prevail, and broken hearts could be healed. The federal marshal's office had become a second home to the woman over the past 2 months. She spent her days there, working with Marshal Harrison and his team, going through documents, identifying suspects, helping to piece together the full scope of the criminal network that had destroyed her life. The child attended a school run by the church, a place where she was slowly learning to be a child again, to laugh without fear, to play without constantly looking over her shoulder. But the woman knew that healing was far from complete, that scars ran deeper than the eye could see, and that true recovery would take years, perhaps a lifetime. One afternoon, as the woman sat in the marshal's office reviewing witness statements, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The rancher had been found, unconscious near the edge of the city, beaten severely. The documents he had been carrying were gone. Everything they had worked so hard to preserve had been stolen. The woman's blood ran cold. She knew immediately what had happened. The gang still had reach, still had resources, still had people willing to commit violence to protect their secrets. She ran to the medical office where the rancher had been taken, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped animal. When she saw him lying in the bed, his face swollen and bruised, his body wrapped in bandages, She felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. All the progress they had made seemed to crumble. All the hope began to fade. She sat beside him and took his hand, feeling how cold it was, how still, and she wept. The doctor told her that the rancher had been lucky. His attackers had wanted to kill him, but a passing merchant had frightened them away before they could finish what they had started. He would recover, but it would take time. He would have scars, both visible and invisible. He had lost consciousness trying to protect the documents, trying to fight off his attackers, and in the end they had taken everything. But the rancher had not given up. When he regained consciousness 3 days later, the first thing he asked about was not his own injuries but the documents. "Are they safe?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from pain. When the woman told him they were stolen, she saw something break in his eyes. But then, slowly, determination returned. "We gather them again," he said. "We get more evidence. We find another way." The woman shook her head. "You've done enough," she said. "You've given enough. It's not your fight anymore." "It is my fight," the rancher replied, his voice gaining strength. "It became my fight the moment I lifted you from that sack in the rain. It became my fight the moment I looked into that child's eyes. Some fights are worth fighting, and some people are worth dying for. You and that girl? You're worth it." Marshal Harrison came to see the rancher while he was still recovering. The marshal was furious about the stolen documents, but he also had news. "We have copies," he told the rancher. "Your wife had the wisdom to make copies of the most important documents before we began our investigation. We've been quietly building our case with that information. The evidence you provided gave us the foundation, but we've been able to gather additional corroborating evidence on our own." The rancher looked at the woman with new understanding. "You did this?" he asked. She nodded. "I didn't trust that one set of documents would be enough," she explained. "My husband taught me to always have a backup plan. I made copies and hid them in different locations throughout the city. I wasn't going to let anyone take away our chance at justice." Not again. Over the following weeks, as the rancher healed, the federal investigation accelerated. With the copies of the documents and the new evidence that Marshal Harrison had gathered independently, arrests began to happen across multiple states. Corrupt officials were exposed, trafficking networks were dismantled, safe houses were discovered, and the people imprisoned in them were freed. The ripples of justice spread wider and deeper than anyone had expected. The woman visited the rancher every day, bringing him news of the investigation, bringing him meals from the boarding house, bringing her daughter to sit with him, to hold his hand, to remind him why he had fought so hard. The child had begun to see him not as a rescuer, but as family. She brought him drawings she had made at school, simple pictures of horses and ranches and mountains, pictures filled with hope and color. He displayed each one carefully on the wall of his room. When the rancher was finally well enough to leave the medical office, a month after his attack, he was greeted as a hero. The newspapers had gotten wind of his role in breaking the trafficking gang, and his story had captured the public imagination. The lonely rancher who had stumbled upon 2 refugees in the rain, who had risked everything to help them, who had been beaten nearly to death trying to protect evidence of justice. He became a symbol of courage and redemption. But the rancher did not want to be a symbol. He wanted to go home. He wanted to leave the city and its crowds and its complications behind. He wanted to return to his ranch, but not alone, never alone again. He looked at the woman and the child, at the family that had formed through tragedy and survival, and he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. "Let's go home," he said simply. The woman smiled. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They left the capital city on a clear morning, the rancher still moving carefully, still healing from his wounds, but moving forward nonetheless. The child rode her favorite horse, the gentle mare that had carried her through mountains and danger. The woman rode beside the rancher, no longer afraid, no longer running. The 3 of them moved across the plains toward the ranch, toward a future that was uncertain but no longer hopeless. As they rode, the rancher thought about the costs of their journey, the violence, the loss, the pain that would never completely fade. He thought about the woman's husband, about his sacrifice, about how one man's determination to do what was right had created ripples that would continue to expand outward. changing lives, saving people, preventing untold suffering. He thought about his own life, about how he had spent so many years hiding, thinking that isolation was safety, thinking that solitude was peace. He had been wrong. True peace came from connection, from purpose, from standing with others in the face of darkness. True safety came not from walls, but from community, from family, from the courage to fight for those you loved.